All right. It truly is a pleasure to be joined again on Bad Faith podcast by Stephen Donziger. You all are very well of him. Sorry. You guys are all very aware of his story. Not only has he come on this podcast in the past, you've probably seen him on multiple left platforms talking about the real rank injustice of how he has been treated for the crime of securing a historically large judgment against Chevron, originally at Texaco, for their unconscionable levels of pollution in the rainforest of Ecuador. Welcome back, Stephen.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
So I want to talk to you a little bit, give us an update on what kind of post house arrest, post prison sentence life has been like for you.
Well, thank you. I just want to emphasize that, I was detained for almost 3 years. I don't feel like I did anything wrong, much less commit a crime. And remind people I was prosecuted not by the U.S. government for contempt of court, but by a Chevron lawyer.
Yeah.
And what I believe is the first private corporate prosecution in the history of our country. It's preposterous that it happened. It's more preposterous that she locked me up for over 2 years pre-trial in a misdemeanor. The longest sentence prior to mine imposing a lawyer for this offense level was 90 days of home confinement. And I was over 10 times that amount. So it was quite an ordeal. I will say, since last April, when with the support of so many people, including many independent journalists like yourself, Brianna, I was released. My ankle bracelet was finally taken off. And since then, obviously I've enjoyed my freedom, but it's been kind of challenging to try to get my life back. I will say that I still don't have the freedom to travel. The court will not renew my passport, which prevents me from visiting Ecuador, where I worked for 28 years, helping Amazon indigenous peoples hold Chevron accountable for this terrible oil pollution. I can't travel out of the country to other places around the world where I'm invited to speak or participate in conferences. And they also took my law license, which I'm trying to get back, so I can't practice law. That said, I'm continuing on as an advocate. I'm writing a book about the whole experience, and I'm continuing to use my platform both to fight for the people of Ecuador and to sort of call attention to other injustices that are happening all over the United States and around the world at the hands of the fossil fuel industry and other sort of corporate actors. So I'm good. My family's well. Could be better, but we keep moving on. So I'm really excited about the future.
Well, I really appreciate and have always appreciated your focus on the, instigating crime and the people of Ecuador, and, want to talk to you about exactly that and the continuing kind of criminalization of people who are advocates on behalf of the environment. But first, I want to follow up on what you said about your passport. What's the justification for them holding on to it?
It's crazy. I don't actually think it's legal. This is all coming from Judge Kaplan, who was the one who I think he's the one who charged me with criminal contempt of court when there was no basis for it. The case was rejected by the government prosecutor, and he's the one who appointed the Chevron prosecutor to lock me up. He's also keeping my passport on the theory that until I give Chevron my computer and cell phone and all my confidential information, attorney-client privilege information, he's going to keep my passport. So we're sort of at a stalemate right now. We'll see how it plays out. I hope to get it back soon. I think it's completely unjustified that he is able to deprive me of my right to travel, which, by the way, is a fundamental right under our Constitution in the United States. To try to coerce me into violating my ethical duties to my clients. But it remains to be seen how it plays out. It will be played out in court, both his court and probably a higher court over time. But in the meantime, I don't have the passport and I can't go anywhere, other than around the United States, which, by the way, I appreciate. I have been traveling some, but it's fundamentally, I think, designed by Chevron and Judge Kaplan to deny me the ability to do my job as a human rights lawyer. One of the key things we need to do now for the people of Ecuador, since Chevron still refuses to pay even $1 of the $9.5 billion historic pollution judgment that our team won, what we need to do, or what the Ecuadorian communities need to do, is enforce the judgment against the company's assets in different countries. And, I think it's by design that, they have deprived me of my right to leave this country to help my clients organize those efforts. I
Right,
think
because
that,
initially the case was filed in New York, right? And then
yeah,
one significant setback was them saying that the case had to be litigated in Ecuador, despite the oil company being incorporated, right, in upstate New York or something like that.
Texaco was in White Plains, New York, just
Right,
outside New York City.
Westchester,
Well,
right.
yeah. So we initially filed it here. They wanted it there. We got there, started litigating there. When they realized they were going to lose based on the evidence, they started attacking the courts where they had insisted the trial take place. Then they came back to the United States, just to be clear, where the Ecuadorians wanted the underlying environmental trial to happen, and they refused. But they came back to these courts that they said were not good enough to attack me and my clients before this very pro-Chevron judge, who has investments in Chevron and never should have presided over the case, should have recused himself for these obvious conflicts of interest. But kept going and denied me a jury in a civil case, and that it led to this criminal contempt charge. And again, I think the purpose is retaliation. They're angry because of my role in helping the people of Ecuador, the indigenous peoples, farmer communities in the Amazon, hold them accountable for the world's worst oil pollution. By the way, let's not forget Chevron, through its predecessor company, Texaco, deliberately dumped billions of gallons of cancer-causing toxic waste into the Amazon. They poisoned a whole 1,500 square mile area of forest where the 5 indigenous groups have lived for thousands of years, dependent on streams, rivers, groundwater for their drinking water. It all got poisoned in a matter of 15 years. So
Yeah.
they're angry that, I played a role in helping people who had very little or no money find good lawyers, both in Ecuador and the United States and other countries, in Canada and elsewhere, and really go after them. And we've won some amazing court victories. They still refuse to pay the judgment, and they play possum. Their whole idea is to just delay, and muck it up and throw sand into the gears of the system, because they benefit by not paying, and they're happy to pay lawyers literally, hundreds of millions of dollars a year. There's hundreds of lawyers, by the way, working on this for Chevron.
Yeah.
To not pay the impoverished indigenous peoples whose cultures and lives they are destroying. So it's a real outrage. And, we have to look, we've done a great job holding them accountable. The reason they're attacking me, the reason a Chevron prosecutor locked me up in the nation's first corporate prosecution, is because they're not used to being held accountable. They're angry, and they're willing to abuse the law to get back at people who they think were involved in holding them accountable. They're very angry at me. But the reality is they should look in the mirror and really deal with the problem they created in Ecuador, which is still killing people day by day down there because of exposures to cancer-causing toxins.
Well, Stephen, before we move on to the substance, I just want to get some clarification on what's going on with this passport. So people who don't remember, the charge for which you were locked up and put on house arrest was a contempt charge. And the basis of the contempt charge was that you had not disclosed some number of documents, which you argued made your clients vulnerable to attacks, the likes of which have become, I think, pretty common, increasingly common in the context of environmental advocacy. And frankly, common in a lot of these kinds of people versus corporations disputes where there are particularly marginalized, like the David and Goliath story is even bigger than it is in the United States oftentimes, because they're talking about various indigenous communities. We've heard about the Nestle stories and, various child labor stories and all of these kinds of things around the world. But that you felt that you were not willing to expose your clients to the kind of personal information that was in your possession and that they wanted to be discoverable. I just read through the reason that we're talking today and why this episode is kind of time tight to something is that you recently got the Supreme Court. The way you characterized it on your Substack was the Supreme Court is forced to answer for why the Supreme Court made the prosecution explain why they thought it was appropriate to have this corporate prosecution as you've characterized it. And even in this briefing, what's interesting is that they seem to still be focused on getting that disclosure. Help me understand, is there still an interest in securing those documents and that's why they're still holding onto your passport? And if so, for what reason?
So I don't think that's really the issue. I don't think they have many documents that would be of great interest to them. So look, trying to get my confidential documents, that is documents protected by attorney-client privilege, which is a sacrosanct area of privilege in the law. Like, you can't be an attorney if your client thinks that what he or she tells you or documents you create in furtherance of your representation is going to be given to the government or to your adversary, in this case, Chevron. I mean, no one would trust you. And I think this whole order was designed to divide me from my clients and get them to fire me. So he put me in a position where I either had to comply with what I think is a patently illegal order and betray my clients, or take my ethical duties to my clients seriously and not comply with what I think was an illegal order. So, by the way, I did neither. I essentially appealed the order. I didn't not comply. I appealed it. And while I was appealing his order, he locked me up, claiming I didn't comply with an order I was appealing, which again has never happened before in this country. So there was all sorts of unprecedented, what I would call judicial harassment of me by Chevron and this particular U.S. federal judge, Lou Kaplan. Ultimately, I think that Chevron likes having leverage over me. Like the passport issue. They don't want me to travel. Yeah, they want to, say, oh, you want your passport back? Then you have to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, ultimately, they want me to leave the case and not work on it anymore. I'm effective at what I do. And they're trying to just, I think, abuse the law to get leverage over me to try to prevent me from being the most effective advocate I can be, which includes travel. When you're an
This is what's so confusing, Stephen, because when I'm trying to understand this, because, it is a really, it's incredible. It's incredible as it's described what has happened to you. And I'm trying to understand what the court's justification is, because it's not that I'm crediting them, but I'm trying to understand how they're justifying these kind of actions. And in this most recent order, it's a lot of, you didn't preserve your rights on you didn't, bring this argument for the district court, but for the district court, you've, it's all of these procedural reasons why you're no longer allowed to make the substantive case at this point, as opposed to, an argument on the underlying merits. And there's like little to nothing about the fact of who it is that has been assigned to prosecute this case. Just the fact of it being outsourced to an independent entity, right? Like that's the focus of it. And I just skimmed it, so maybe I skimmed over it, but there's little to nothing about the fact that it is in fact, lawyers that have this conflict of interest with Chevron, who are the ones that are prosecuting the case.
It's interesting you say that. You're totally right. You read it correctly. Like what I just said about how the judge appointed a Chevron lawyer to prosecute me and lock me up in the name of the U.S. government. Think about that. Chevron locked me up in the name of the U.S. government is shocking. But when you read the briefs, it's all framed in this esoterica, this technical legal stuff about the appointments clause to the Constitution, which is this obscure provision which prevents any U.S. government employee from not being supervised by the executive branch.
Right.
I mean, I forgive you if you don't really understand that issue, because frankly, I've been practicing law 30 years and I didn't understand it.
It made me very happy not to be a lawyer anymore. I'll say that reading this briefing. I was like, oh yeah, this sucks.
You think it would be enough to write that I was prosecuted by Chevron and locked up after winning a big civil judgment against them, and they would then rule in my favor. But no, there's not a word about that. It's about how this private Chevron prosecutor, the appointment of her, violated the appointments clause to the Constitution. Be that as it may, that's how it's framed legally. I think it's, a bit sterile, and I would have done it differently. But, the expert lawyers who specialize in some of these appellate issues have decided that's the best way to go. I mean, our goal is to get my conviction, I would argue my legal conviction reversed, by the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, I know people are like, what are you, crazy? Like, why would the U.S. Supreme Court help a guy like you? Well, the reality is, Brianna, that, private corporate prosecutions are so offensive to the rule of law that I have had support from all sort of places on the political spectrum. I mean, conservative lawyers, progressive lawyers are outraged by the concept of a private corporate prosecution, particularly of a human rights lawyer, an environmental lawyer, by an oil company. I mean, it's just really something you would think would be associated with the authoritarian, autocratic government, not the United States, which purports to be a rule of law country. So, I'm attracting support from a wide spectrum of people, and I actually think we have a moderately decent chance before even this very conservative Supreme Court to prevail, because I think this is just so beyond the pale. It's never happened before, should never happen again. It's obviously not legal, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the judgment, it is odd that this huge 9 billion plus judgment is in some ways the footnote in the story as it's told. Where are we? What's the posture of that actually being secured and delivered to the people who have been harmed? Again, I don't want to lose sight of the spate of cancer diagnoses and deaths, families devastated, et cetera, in the region. Where's the money?
I love that question. Thank you for asking it. First of all, this case is not about me. Let me be very clear about that. I mean, thanks for inviting me on. I'm happy to tell the story. I do have a personal story. It's less important than the story of the people of Ecuador. They are connected, but the people of Ecuador really is where the focus needs to be. There are tens of thousands of indigenous peoples and farmers in the Amazon where Chevron operated who are suffering, who cannot get clean water. They cannot get medical care. They are drinking poison water every day because they have no alternative. They are bathing in contaminated rivers because they have no alternative. And I would say a fair number, quietly, almost imperceptibly, are dying of cancer every day without medical treatment because of these exposures. This is a mass death event happening incrementally over time. I personally believe, based on what I've seen, and this is anecdotal because there's been no actual epidemiological studies, or I should say health surveys about this, but I think thousands of people have died from these exposures. And I think thousands more will die based on some data from some health evaluations that took place in the 1990s in this region, which showed incredibly high rates of cancer where Chevron operated compared to other parts of Ecuador. So it's a serious, serious problem. Now, where's the money? When we won the judgment, it was affirmed on appeal by Ecuador's Supreme Court and Ecuador's Constitutional Court and Canada's Supreme Court for enforcement purposes. They still refuse to pay. So they're mocking the people of Ecuador and sort of daring them to chase Chevron around the world into other countries where they have assets. Because, by the way, they sold off all their assets in Ecuador in anticipation of losing our case. So they're daring them to go chase them into other countries like Canada and try to collect their assets. But it's very complicated, it's very expensive, and it's another example of how the judicial system, I think, is structurally rigged to favor those with more resources, in this case, the fossil fuel industry. It's really hard for people to come out of Ecuador after they agreed to try the case there. Chevron did, accept jurisdiction there. They refused to pay, and now they're basically mocking the indigenous peoples. Look, bottom line, I believe Chevron will be paying this judgment.
How?
The affected communities have a legal team, not me, other lawyers in other countries who are going, I hope, to file actions to seize Chevron's assets to force compliance with this judgment. It's a pretty basic mechanism in these types of international disputes. It happens in lots of contexts, mostly the commercial context, not so much this human rights kind of context, but it's routine. It's actually done routinely in other types of commercial cases. It should be done routinely here. They lost the case. They lost it in a court where they accepted jurisdiction. As a condition of going to Ecuador, they promised to pay any adverse judgment. They lied. They went back on their word. And judges in other countries where they have assets need to validate this judgment and force Chevron to pay it. If they don't, they should threaten to seize their assets in those countries.
But can you help us understand why it hasn't happened thus far? Because the original judgment was in what year again?
2011, then it was affirmed in 2013, really.
Okay, so we're talking a decade ago is when this judgment came down. What has been going on legally since then? I understand that you haven't been involved in all aspects of this litigation. Obviously, you had a lot on your plate personally by design. But, if this is a fairly routine thing to happen, as I would expect to enforce these kinds of judgments, corporations aren't brand new at this. I'm sure they've been running this playbook of, cashing out in the venue where the judgment is and fleeing to other parts of the world. Obviously, we saw it in this case that a corporation, Texaco was bought by Chevron, and oftentimes they try to shield those lower judgments from being the responsibility of the new company. There's all kinds of ways to try to get around these sorts of things. But like you said, this isn't new stuff. So what's been going on? Has this just been winding through the courts in all these other countries? Have there been issues with funding a legal team? I mean, what's been the holdup?
Well, there's all sorts of challenges, but just understand fundamentally, the Ecuadorians filed actions to enforce the judgment in Brazil, in Argentina, and in Canada back in the 2013-14 period. Chevron went into Brazil and Argentina. I won't get into the details. They engaged in lobbying and I believe corrupt acts that essentially led to the dismissal, not on the merits, but for various technical reasons, the courts wouldn't let the enforcement take place against their assets in those countries. So those cases got knocked out. In Canada, we had a huge amount of success. We won a victory at the Supreme Court level, but Chevron then hired 4 different law firms in Canada to try to muck up the case. And they basically, for technical reasons, convinced a court that the Ecuadorians could not enforce the judgment against Chevron's assets in Canada because they were owned by a company called Chevron Canada, that is a subsidiary of Chevron, wholly owned by Chevron, same board of directors as Chevron, controlled by Chevron in every manner possible. But they claimed like they created like this fictitious separation between the parent company and their Canadian subsidiary. And because the assets were in the subsidiary, they said we can never collect anyway. So that issue is still being litigated. But my point is, this is what they do. Like, they raise all sorts of crazy doctrines and legal issues that can take 2-3 years, each one, to litigate. And they're all blocking maneuvers to prevent the indigenous people of Ecuador from collecting on their judgment. I mean, even if you win them, it's cheaper for them to buy 2 years of time or 3 years of time paying lawyers than to pay the underlying judgment. So, things like that have been happening. And then there's an issue of resources. Like, we need resources. A lot of lawyers cannot work pro bono, even though I work for virtually nothing and others do. We need substantial resources to be able to do this. By the way, we're constantly raising money on our website, which is called freedonziger.com, if you want to help. And our funding model, by the way, is based fundamentally on a high volume of small donations, sort of, Bernie Sanders campaign style, lack of a better comparison. So if you go to the site and give $5, $10, $25, $50, $100, it helps us a lot. But the challenge really is to get moving with a sufficient amount of resources to fight through all these blocking maneuvers that Chevron's lawyers try to create. But it's eminently doable. But, it's funny, Brianna, it is routine in the commercial context, but because the indigenous people are doing it, I've noticed this in my years of working on this. And it's a human rights case, and it involves billions of dollars. And it's about, relatively under-resourced people, going after a big oil company. It's like the judges put 10 extra layers of scrutiny on it, and they just slow it down. Because most judges, whether in the U.S., whether they're in the U.S. or Canada, really come out of the corporate law world, and it's tough. I mean, we're always sort of swimming upstream because the whole system is designed to keep those with no money down. And we see that, of course, in our country all across the board. And we're also seeing in the context of this case, although I do believe we can overcome it with the right strategy, lawyers, and resources.
Well, to that end, Stephen, I was recently reading this really excellent piece in New York Magazine called How to Live in a Catastrophe. And they were talking about the kind of philosophy of folks like Andreas Malm, whose book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, kind of took the world by storm because of its provocative title, but really is making the case for why some people, when faced with the ways in which the system is really rigged to prevent advocates from having positive outcomes by using the system as it's designed, have chosen to other kinds of avenues, like directly destroying property related to fossil fuel infrastructure, et cetera. At one point made in the article is that the advocacy group, I'm reading from it now, Stop Fossil Fuels, crunched some compelling numbers. The 15,000 months of activist collective time and the $20 million spent on the Standing Rock and No Dobble campaigns slowed pipeline completion by 3 months. From 2016 to 2017, Ruby Montoya and Jessica Resnick, then ages 27 and 35, torched holes in the Dakota Access Pipeline across Iowa. They spent, before their arrests, not counting their 6 and 8 year prison sentences, 10 person months and several $1,000s, mostly on the kits they were using to blow things up. Their investment delayed pipeline completion 2 months further. The point that's being made is that two people with, a handful of months of effort delayed the pipeline construction 2 months. 15,000 activists and all of these legal fees and $20 million delayed the pipeline by 3 months, just one additional month. And so I wonder what you make of these kinds of strategies and the enthusiasm, especially in a very despairing, kind of pessimistic climate community, this enthusiasm around just taking taking these kind of actions in hand and not trying to use the courts.
Well, look, I personally cannot endorse any illegal activity. I'm a lawyer, and but however, if you analyze it clinically, you can sort of understand it. I think it was John Kennedy who said, when peaceful change is impossible, revolution is inevitable. Mm-hmm. And there is a segment in the climate movement that is so frustrated with the obstructionism, with the lack of progress in the COP meetings. I mean, COP 27, the meeting in Egypt, really produced very little. There's still no requirement, for example, for countries to come up with a plan to phase out fossil fuels, and we're on the tipping point now of the point of no return with our planet. We have like 2-3 years, and they can't even do something as simple as come up with a plan for the orderly transition away from fossil fuels. So people are really, really frustrated. There's a movie coming out, by the way, based on that book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, an independent film. Mm-hmm. I think there is a whole segment of the climate movement that is increasingly going to use, what I would call civil disobedience to make its point. And by the way, what Jessica Resnick did, what you described with the pipeline, vandalizing the pipeline and blocking its use for, I think you said 2 months. I mean, she ended up being designated as a terrorist.
Right.
By her sentencing judge, and she was sentenced to 8 years in prison, which is utterly draconian. And by the way, we just saw 5 people in Atlanta trying to save a forest from the construction of this Cop City thing. Who knows what that is? It sounds really bizarre. This big police academy that wanted to raise this beautiful forest, and they were sitting in the forest, and they were charged with terrorism. And
yeah, I wanted you to talk about that because I saw you tweeting about that too. Yeah. I mean, what do you make? I mean, it doesn't feel like, I think it's quite objectively the case that there is a purposeful ratcheting up of these kind of sentences and a very punitive push toward these environmental activists, precisely because I feel like there is an understanding that this is where the movement is going. This is the desperation that people feel. We've been ignored. Cases like yours have come down the pike. People see that playing by the rules isn't manifesting in results. And this is what people feel like is right. So they feel like they have to, the state feels that they have to really crack down on these folks.
Well, let me be very clear. The fossil fuel industry has a global, not just the US, but Australia, Canada, and other oil-producing countries, campaign, lobbying effort to convince state governments, be they in Australia, provincial governments like New South Wales, we've seen this happen. The state of Georgia, there's now 17 states with these enhancement laws,
right,
that impose draconian sentences on peaceful protesters when they're physically at some sort of oil installation, as if oil installations, actually the facilities responsible for destroying our planet deserve some special protection over a Walmart, for example. So there's a special category being carved out in the law for the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry that is designed, frankly, to intimidate climate activists from protesting at these installations. But I will point out, in my humble opinion, It is these activists, these protests that are absolutely critical for us to be able to save the planet and to save all of life's ecosystems, because we're going off the rails. And it will only be citizen action, in my opinion, that has a chance of convincing governments and this industry to stop what they're doing and reverse course. So if they're trying to target the very frontline Earth defenders who are so vital to protecting all of us with charges of terrorism, which, by the way, are totally bogus, okay? This is not terrorism. Terrorism is the use of indiscriminate violence, okay, to instill fear in the civilian population. Tree sitting to save a forest from being razed to build a police academy is not terrorism. It's civil disobedience. I'm not saying they're not going to be punished. I mean, when people commit civil disobedience, you make a calculated choice. I'm going to take this risk in service of a larger point. That's what Gandhi did. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. did. That's what people have done throughout our history, okay? But they're not terrorists. And the fact that they're passing laws, for example, in Georgia, their domestic terrorism law, like, is so vague. I mean, it could cover almost anything anyone does in terms of, protesting something. So it's very political. It's designed to intimidate, and it's unnecessary. I think these laws should be abolished. If people commit offenses, criminal offenses, as a result of civil disobedience, there's plenty of other laws that they can be charged with, starting with trespassing or, illegally occupying property. I mean, there's so many ways you can charge these people. They're not terrorists. It is designed to intimidate the entire climate movement. People need to be aware of it. And it's really, the fossil fuel industry is lobbying furiously for states all across our country to pass these laws.
Yeah, I mean, look, you say people need to be aware of it. And yet, I would guess that less than 1% of the country, if asked on the street who Jessica Resnicek is, could give you an answer. Much fewer than the number of people who are at the very least aware of, even if they aren't especially supportive of, folks like Julian Assange, or even yourself, Chelsea Manning, and various other people who have gone to prison for some bigger principle. And it concerns me. And it also seems to me a signal about what perhaps their perceived threat level is to the fossil fuel establishment. Because we're not hearing a lot about these people. The idea that a young woman and a climate protester got sentenced to 8 years in jail, 8 or 9 years in jail. And it's barely even a blip, even within the left community. And to see, as you've described, this escalation of these kinds of enhancements to sentences, it's terrifying.
It is. I couldn't, look, when I got detained, okay, but for people like you and Marianne Williamson and Katie Halpern and Crystal Ball and Michael Moore and Ralph Nader and others, okay, that is independent voices, not dependent on corporate advertising, who had the ability to create platforms where the truth could be told. But for you, no one would have heard of me. I mean, the New York Times, I'm a human rights lawyer. I went to Harvard Law School with Barack Obama. He was in my class. I'm sitting there down the street with an ankle bracelet. They wouldn't write a story about me until the day I went to jail. They wrote some little news story.
Yeah.
They cover appropriately. They cover lawyers detained in Turkey and in Myanmar. But like in the United States, there's a real structural bias by the big corporate media. You're not going to hear about these people. Now, they also, the industry benefits from us not connecting the dots. They want everything to be seen in isolation. Oh, there's 5 activists who are tree sitting in Atlanta, whatever. They don't want you to think about that and Jessica Resnicek in the same sentence, or Stephen Donziger. Mm-hmm. Because there is, in my mind, a direct line between what they did to me and these criminal charges against these peaceful climate activists. Okay, what it all has in common is the industry is trying to criminalize those who confront it with its planet-destroying practices, okay? They're trying to criminalize legitimate activism and speech. And that's what they tried to do to me. They could never get the government to prosecute me because I did nothing wrong. So they just did it themselves in the civil context, backed by a judge who denied me a jury and had investments in Chevron and was, in my opinion, very biased.
Yeah, that's part of what's so kind of funny about this this briefing, they basically argue that it doesn't matter. I mean, that was basically under their discretion to appoint this independent prosecutor. Initially, they declined to prosecute because they say they had a dearth of resources. And then when you kind of raise the question of, well, doesn't it matter if they actually supervised? Doesn't it matter actually if the DOJ supervised the independent prosecutor? They say, no, it's that all it matters is that they could have supervised. Right. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. They said they initially didn't want to do this because they don't have the resources. And you're not at all curious about whether that means that, of course, they're not going to have the resources to supervise it either.
Well, it's funny. Of course, they had the resources. I mean, they chose not to do this because they knew the case was bogus. Give me a break. The SDNY prosecutes people from all over the world. I mean, Victor Boot, who was just traded for Brittany Griner, was arrested in Thailand and brought back to New York and prosecuted. Noriega, same thing, brought back to the U.S. So, the idea they didn't have the resources to prosecute like someone sitting in New York for a misdemeanor is ridiculous. Obviously, they did. They chose not to for good reason. And then the judge appointed a Chevron prosecutor to do it. And that's the question on appeal. It's illegal. Like, you can't be prosecuted by a corporation. You're prosecuted by the government or there's no prosecution. That's how our separation of powers system, works in this country. And the brief, by the way, you have in your hand is a brief written by Merrick Garland's Justice Department. And I just want to point out that they kept changing their rationale for what they were doing. When we first raised the issue, they said, oh, we can do this. Okay. Then we sort of pointed out, actually, no, you can't. There's something called the Appointments Clause. So then the prosecutor, the Chevron prosecutor, her name, by the way, is Rita Glavin. She also defends Andrew Cuomo against allegations of, sexual abuse and assault by various of his staffers. Okay.
Of course.
She defends a lot of bad people, Chevron among them. And she was like, oh, actually, I was supervised. We're like, well, I don't think so. So we wrote the DOJ and said, are you supervising? And they wrote back and said, no, we're not, but she has the authority to do this. So finally, we kept pressing this, and the judge suddenly decided, in her opinion, dismissing our motion to get rid of the whole case on this basis, that it was enough for her. It shouldn't have to be supervised. If they had the right to supervise her, that was enough. That meant she was supervised.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just crazy.
It's incredible.
And they've essentially admitted factually what we need. I mean, the question now is the Supreme Court, we have a pretty, our Supreme Court doesn't take a lot of cases. I mean, the Brazil Supreme Court takes 100,000 cases a year. Ours takes 70. Okay, you need to understand that.
100,000? How does it manage that?
They have a lot of justices, and the whole panel, every justice doesn't need to meet on every case. I mean,
how many justices do they have? 100?
No, maybe more than we do. Maybe 15 or 20. I'm not sure.
Huh.
But the point is this. Okay, the court should take this case. They might not, because there's a lot of competition to get cases to them, and so they will accept it. The brief you have in your hand was a brief filed by Garland, who took the side of Chevron. Very disappointing, by the way. I don't get me going on Merrick Garland, but he took the side of
please.
Chevron. I mean,
did it surprise you that he did that?
No. It made me sad. It's funny. I'm the eternal optimist. I thought there maybe be a 20% chance he'd side with it. He really should. This is not an issue. It's not even a close issue. But no, he's I think he's been an incredibly weak attorney general who has not stepped up to the moment, and start with the whole Donald Trump fiasco, where that man still hasn't been indicted. After all these years, all these obvious crimes. I mean, I know he's appointed a special prosecutor, but it's just so slow, and here you have total, appetite, voracious appetite to go after a human rights lawyer, by the system, when the man who completely tried to undermine our country, what's left of our democracy, essentially stage a coup d'etat, is still walking free and hasn't been indicted, even though there's obvious crimes, as we found today, by the way, with what the House committee decided in those criminal referrals. So I think Merrick Garland, the way he's treated a lot of people, Leonard Peltier, the indigenous leader who's been in jail for 48 years for a crime that evidence indicates he probably did not commit. You know, I mean, Biden pardoned 2 turkeys on Thanksgiving. He won't commute Leonard Peltier's sentence, even though he's.
What do you think that's about? It does feel like there are some of these easy wins that the Biden administration
I don't
won't
get it,
just
and I
take.
think, in my case, I've asked him to pardon me. I mean, I sort of don't have any place to go. It seems like all the judges are sort of buying into this notion of a private corporate prosecution. And we'll see what the Supreme Court does, but he should take a stand. I mean, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, Brianna, I don't know if you know this, they issued a very lengthy ruling about my case, calling for me to be compensated for the deprivation of my liberty by the U.S. government, that it violated multiple provisions of international law. I mean, you talk to these Federalist Society judges, and like, we don't care about that. This is the United States. Like, that's international stuff. We do what we want here. But it is extraordinary because this working group is composed of 5 highly respected jurists from around the world who looked at my case in the United States, concluded it was illegal. These same jurists have condemned, for example, the government of Iran for treatment of certain detainees, where the State Department has been more than happy to take those rulings and blast the government of Iran with them. But when they rule against our government for me, a U.S. citizen, they're silent. I mean, I can't get them to react. I mean, it's extraordinary, so there's a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of double standard stuff going on. But the bottom line, Brianna, is there are political prisoners in the United States of America, more than people realize, that Biden could release with the stroke of a pen. He could commute their sentences, people like Jessica Reznicek, Daniel Hale, real people of conscience trying to do good things for our society. Acts of civil disobedience. They've all been punished to some degree or another. But these draconian sentences are completely unjustifiable. I think they make them political prisoners. That's my opinion.
Given how bad things are for the environmental movement, including under a Democratic president and what is still, for the next couple weeks, unified government, Democrat all the way down. Yeah. I mean, I wonder what you make of the approach that we should take to American politics, that environmentalist interested parties should take toward electoral politics, et cetera. We're in a week where there's been a lot of disappointment over the permitting bill. Folks were kind of excited that it got sidelined earlier in this year. People were kind of celebrating the Joe Manchin side deal Joe Manchin side deal didn't make it through. I felt like it was going to be not a part of the Build Back Better enterprise. And now it's been revived, and it looks like they're attaching it to this omnibus bill, and it's going to go through. There have been, concerns and frustrations from groups like the Sunrise Movement, understandably so. And while apparently they didn't directly endorse Joe Biden, I seem to remember an endorsement. I remember the contrast between them giving him an F during the primary and then saying something that seemed akin to an endorsement. I've heard them say that they didn't endorse it, but I remember them saying something like, of course we have to vote for Biden over Donald Trump. But given that's the choice that people are presented with, Joe Biden, who shepherds through these kind of betrayals, like with this Joe Biden deal, with this anemic Build Back Better environmental policies, with not pardoning Peltier, without doing any number of things that are not about the environmental movement that could be done with a stroke of a pen. And given the exigency in particular of the environmental crisis, I know that you can't really comment on doing illegal activities, but I mean, where could people possibly direct their energies elsewhere? And what do you say to folks who are staring down the barrel of a 2024 election and someone like Joe Biden, who seems to have thumbed his nose at the environmental movement in this way? What are people to do?
Okay, so first of all, people need to start with the fundamental understanding. I think most people in the movement have this, which is that the Democratic Party is under corporate control. So we really have 2 corporate parties, Republicans and Democrats. And I think until we stop playing the game of working within those confines and understand that we really need true reform of the Democratic Party, so it becomes democratic and a working person's party, or some alternative to that, some new party, I think we're going to be stuck in this sort of merry-go-round, which I've seen my whole life. I mean, I've been watching this for 40 years. And it's getting worse and worse. I'm just finishing a book now called The Scheme by Senator Whitehouse, which I recommend to everybody. I mean, it's horrifying. This 40, 50-year plan by the corporate oligarchs in our country to take over the Supreme Court, which they've succeeded in doing now. You now have 6 unelected justices making decisions about how the rest of us 330 million people are allowed to live. And they're not elected, and they're hard right ideologues, pro-corporate ideologues. So, I think people need to figure out a path where they can, put forth their truth, free of the shackles of the, corporate-controlled two-party system, and try to either, again, democratize the Democrats.
Which, is a tall order, Steve.
I know. We saw what happened with Bernie and, oh my God, in this campaign. I mean, you had, Debbie Wasserman. I mean, that whole effort to just shut him up, was just an example of how far they will go to maintain, power. And speaking of Chuck Schumer, by the way, very disappointing. I mean, he's my senator. I live in New York. Mm-hmm. He never once came to visit me in my 993 days, of almost all of that at home with an ankle bracelet. I was 45 days in prison. He never spoke out. We reach out to him constantly. I think he's the 3rd largest recipient in the Senate of fossil fuel money.
Well, that's the thing.
He's the Democratic leader, but look what he's done on the antitrust legislation.
Yes, that was the subject of our last episode that actually aired earlier this week. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's outrageous. The guy, his 2 daughters work for big tech.
Right.
He takes massive money from all the big tech companies. And, you finally have a bill that has bipartisan support. It's a modest bill that, among other things, would end the monopoly that Google and Apple have over their app stores. And he won't bring it to a vote. Yeah. I mean, Chuck Schumer, to me, is a personification of the problem with the Democratic Party being under the thumb of the elite, the corporate elites. And it happens every time. We always get disappointed. I mean, if you're in the environmental movement, just understand one fundamental truth, in my opinion. It has to come from the bottom up, okay? It has to come from citizen action and citizen organizing, Extinction Rebellion, Scientist Rebellion, Sunrise. Those are the groups, among many others, that are leading the charge to save our planet. And, that's, I think, where most of the action needs to be.
I mean, this is the problem as I see it, though. And there's so many well-meaning people, and this isn't intended to be, a direct slight or anything like that. But at a certain point, it starts to feel like the idea of reforming the Democratic Party is a complete fiction. I mean, we might as well be looking for the Avatar universe IRL. It doesn't exist. It's not. The obstacles are too great. Not just from what we've seen with Bernie, but the description that you're just giving of Chuck Schumer and how captured he is. All you have to do when you see a Democrat, any politician doing something wrong, is go to Open Secrets, and it becomes very clear immediately why they're behaving the way they're behaving. Yep. That being the case, climate organizations are put in this position where it is both obviously true that the Republicans are worse than Democrats in these issues, but also that the level of reform that is necessary to even begin to put a dent in staving off the cataclysmic effects that are coming down the pike are also nowhere close to where the Democrats are either. So if this is a conversation about the end of the world as we know it, then endorsing either of these parties seems to me to be a kind of tacitly providing cover for either as a solution. I was watching some show recently, and I kept getting this commercial on repeat that was evangelizing Joe Biden as his climate crusader. I wish I had recorded it, or I could figure out if I see it again, I'll try to record it and stick it into this episode. But it was nauseating. It was Joe Biden passed unprecedented climate reform and Green New Deal hero, and he's going to get to these. You would have thought that, we're in an alternate reality where Ralph Nader had won in 2000 and we're living in a utopia. Okay. It was nauseating. And when I look at that, and when I look at the fact that environmental groups are kind of forced into the corner of endorsing the Democratic Party, or they feel as though they're forced into that corner, it seems almost more dangerous to me than Republicans that are out there saying that climate change isn't real or whatever, because they are pacifying the people that need to be the base. They're pacifying when they say it needs to come from the ground up, a lot of the people who are the ground truly believe that the Democrats are doing the best they can. And they're not reading the kind of coverage that you get from The Lever, American Prospect, or The Intercept, or whatever, that's telling you that folks like Chuck Schumer are corrupt. Chuck Schumer to them is a nice guy. Amy Schumer's uncle. You know, he likes all the things that we like. And so, again, getting into that space, understanding the world through that lens, I think gets people to where these climate protesters that are now serving jail times got, and where Andreas Malm has kind of gotten. And you know, it just feels like, but for providing some kind of off-ramp from those kinds of climate actions. I saw some climate action in France where they were disabling, I think it was a coal plant. A bunch of people in like white hazmat suits went into the forest and went into the fields and just dismantled a coal plant. It's hard for me, you know, I guess I'm not saying this to you. I'm saying this to the world who might be listening. If you don't provide people an off-ramp, I don't think that even no amount of criminalizing is going to prevent people from realizing that that's the only path forward.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that they're trying to intimidate the movement. I think I don't think it's going to work. I mean, I think we all, you as a journalist, me as an advocate, we all need to call it out when we see it, which I try to do on my platforms. I know you try to do the same. And we need to keep building the movement and amplifying the voices that they're trying to silence. I mean, it's a victory against the fossil fuel industry that I'm on your podcast right now. I mean, they threw everything they had at me. They threw hundreds of lawyers at me. They sued me for $60 billion. Okay. Initially. I got sued, by the way, for the most money of anyone in U.S. history.
What?
Yeah.
What was what was the basis of that monetary amount?
That number comes from, because we had initially won a $20 billion environmental judgment in Ecuador. And they then sued me under a civil racketeering law that allows treble damages. Theory was that, you know, since I had gotten the $20 billion judgment, they were going to get 60 from me. And like, you know, I'm a human rights lawyer. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan with my wife and son, as you know. I don't have $60 billion. I don't have $1 million. Okay. But I'm a human rights guy. But again, like, they knew they would never get anything close to that from me, but they did it because of the symbolic meaning to try to intimidate others who might think about joining our case or just doing this work. They don't want lawyers doing what I did, you know, and they think by attacking me, they're going to discourage other lawyers from doing the same, but I don't think it's going to work. I cannot tell you the number of people who have reached out to me, lawyers all over the world, advocates, students. I get invited to speak all over the place. You know, I've spoken at, Fordham and St. John's Law Schools in New York and NYU and Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Tennessee. And I get invited all over the place to speak to students. And they love hearing the story. They get empowered by it. It's not going to work. They tried to shut me up. I now have a bigger platform than I ever could have imagined. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but when I got arrested, I had 3,000 Twitter followers. I didn't even understand Twitter. Someone else was running my account. Okay? And I'm like, well, I'm home, you know, I'll start tweeting. And like, I quickly realized, I mean, not only did I like enjoy tweeting, but it became a sort of a cordon of protection for me and my family, because the more people who got engaged with our journey, the harder it would be for them to put out their lies about me, you know? So, you know, I say the same for you. I have so much respect for what you've built, Brianna, because, you know, I mean, not only did it help me personally, it's helping so many people. And really, it's the only way to get our voices heard outside the, you know, the media, the big media that depends on corporate advertising that are never going to really cover these stories. I mean, the New York Times is, you know, look, they occasionally do good articles, but overall, it's an extremely weak institution that will not take on the fossil fuel industry, on which the Times is heavily dependent for its advertising revenue. It's just that simple, guys. Yeah. There's no to sort of pretend otherwise. Yeah, they'll tell you their editorial decisions are independent of advertising. They say that, but it's not actually true. They know where their bread is buttered, and it's up to people like you and other independent journalists to keep doing the work you're doing. So I salute you. And I tell you, the reason they failed to silence me is partly because of people like you. So I thank you for that.
Well, look, I appreciate you saying that. It feels like a drop in the bucket and not nearly enough. But I do think that what you're saying is part of why when folks are so glib about Twitter and what happens with Musk and, oh, I'm just going to leave, it's taken a lot of people a lot of time to build up,
tell me about
a community on Twitter. There are so many independent journalists that are able to find eyes for their work because of their presence on Twitter. I feel like I owe my entire career to Twitter. I was just an anonymous, disgruntled attorney who hated her day job, who just started tweeting a lot and eventually started writing articles.
Were you practicing? I didn't know you were an attorney.
We share an alma mater.
Oh,
yeah.
That's crazy. So but you're not practicing law anymore, are you?
No, absolutely not. I feel bad. I mean, I truly hated it. And I practiced for about 7 years. I clerked for a year and then practiced for 6 years at a corporate law in New York. And when Ryan Grimm at The Intercept reached out to me on the basis of the freelance articles they had done over the course of the following year to come work full time at The Intercept, it was like, it was a godsend. I never imagined I'd be able to escape. I have all these student loans. I mean, it still was a huge pay cut, but it was enough for me to subsist until I figured something out. I mean, went on an income-based repayment program. But it was freedom because I was a corporate lawyer. I was the bad guy. We weren't dealing with these kinds of cases. It was mostly just like employment law cases, like poaching cases, that kind of thing. Rich people stealing money from other rich people, kind of a deal. But it was demoralizing. But what I understood, I think, from that experience and from having some really good law professors, I don't know if you know John Hanson. He's a Harvard law professor.
I know about John Hanson, yeah.
He was my favorite. It was very radicalizing because he's kind of like this undercover Marxist teaching corporate law. And he makes it very explicit how much the system is designed to do exactly what it does and to prevent even the most well-meaning people from working within it to do good. Not that one shouldn't try, but it has informed my approach and made me really value independent streams like Twitter and YouTube and these media spheres. And I just hope that whatever happens with Twitter and however people feel about Elon Musk, that they aren't willing to kind of sacrifice the platform and what it means because this man throwing a tantrum is doing everything that he can to make it an intolerable place.
I want to second that. I mean, some people said you should leave Twitter. I'm like, well, I don't like how Elon is managing Twitter, to be clear, but I'm not leaving Twitter. I mean, that's what the right wing wants people like you and me to do. Leave Twitter, leave a platform where we can reach a lot of people around the world quickly.
Yeah.
So, I'm staying the course and I'm hoping, look, it wasn't perfect before. It's less perfect now, but I'm hoping it all works out. I have a gut feeling that ultimately he's going to have to sell it back, sort of a more responsible type of ownership structure. Because running it this way, I don't think is going to lead to a sustainable business. I think, people are just not, advertisers are not going to be comfortable with it.
It's killing him with Tesla. That's the thing. It's killing him with the company where his money actually is. So we'll see what happens. But look, I appreciate you so much for joining me today here, Stephen. And can you let the people know where to find you on the Bird app and everywhere else on the internet?
So on Twitter, I'm at @Donziger, Donziger. On Instagram, at Stephen Donziger with a V, Steven. I'm on Substack too. I sort of just started that. Check it out. Subscribe. It's free. If you want to pay, I'd appreciate it, but you don't have to. And you can reach me in those places. I also have a website called freedonziger.com where you can sign up. You'll get emails, some solicitations. You can donate money, but more importantly, you can be part of our community. It's the community that's kept me and my family alive and gotten us through this. I mean, we literally have had over 100,000 people around the world sign up on our website since I was detained. We want to keep building that because we have a lot of work to do. We have to finish the job against Chevron and also take on some other human rights issues that we're looking at. So please join us. We do, I think, really innovative, important, meaningful work to try to help people and also to call out wrongdoers and to call attention to some of these violations of civil liberties and attempts to undermine our democracy by the fossil fuel industry. So thanks so much for having me. Again, it's freedonziger.com.
Thank you for that. And anyone who wants more Bad Faith every week knows that they can go and get it at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for an additional Monday episode. See you later tonight to discuss this episode over on the Callin app. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.